Before we start, is there questions about anything, content from last week? Okay. Assignment 2 I just posted. I'll show it to you quickly. It's an assignment we've used in the past. So it's due in 2 weeks. What you'll do is you'll do a cognitive walkthrough, kind of like what we did in class with Tor, but you'll hopefully do it in a little more detail than the detail I gave. But you'll do the exact same process. So the tool you'll do it on is called Ghostery. It's kind of like a privacy tool that looks at your cookies and different things that track you. And some of the stuff we'll talk about this week and next week might help you as well, just to have a general mental understanding of how web tracking works. But other than that, it's sort of up to you to understand enough about how cookies work to understand what it's actually doing. And so, yeah, you just plug it into a browser. The browsers are free, and Ghostery itself is free as well. But you do have to have Chrome or something else. If you need it, I understand there's lab computers that have Chrome installed that are available to you as students. And so what you'll do is you'll come up with the core tasks. So you're going to come up with them yourself. So what would someone want to do that wanted to use this tool? Okay, what would be the different things that they might want to do? Justify why they're a core task. And then what you'll do is you'll do the actual walkthrough on 3 of them. So you can pick, I'd like you to pick the 3 most substantial, so not like the 3 easiest or most trivial ones. And so when you look at your 7, pick the 3 that are kind of the most important, or the ones that involve the most steps, or like a usability study would be the most important for. And then you just walk through. You can use the guidelines that were given in class for Tor, so the 8 guidelines. You can just use them. If you really don't like them or you want to add one, you can do that as well. So there's no marks associated with that, but you're free to invent and justify any other guidelines that you might want to do. Otherwise, you can just use those guidelines. And for every step you want to say both is it good or is it bad, right? So is there room for improvement, or if you see something that they did really well, you can comment on that as well. So positive and negative, always going back to the guidelines. Okay, questions about it? Okay, so it's due on November 17th. If you did not slip on assignment 1, then you might as well slip on assignment 2 because there's no other assignments. But if you use your slip day on assignment 1, then for assignment 2, you do have to hand it in on the deadline, which is the Wednesday. Otherwise, you can hand it in on Friday. Same thing, EAS, PDF. The TA requested that it not be handwritten, so that it be typed up. And make sure your names and student numbers are on it too. I think that was another problem with assignment 1. And try and put it in the right folder. That's basically it. Okay, and any questions about marking for assignment 1 and assignment 2 when it's marked? You can direct to the marker as opposed to me, although I'll forward your messages on, but I don't have anything to do with marking the assignments. And you'll get your marks back through EAS just like in assignment 1. Okay, yeah. So start with a marker. I mean, if you can't resolve it with her, then she'll come to me, and so that's fine. But yeah, you're welcome. Okay, other questions about the assignment or anything else? Okay, so just a reminder, we're almost another month, I guess, and then so a few more classes, and the exam, the final exam or test, will be in class, and it's at the end of this month. So there's only 3 lectures between now and then the very last class we'll just use it to review, and you can ask about my project.
It's a request. Can we get a week gap before the exam so that we can study?
I can't schedule so the problem is that the university has restrictions on when I can schedule it. So yeah, I can't do it. I would love to put it on the last day of class, and then yeah, maybe we could have a review course in between. But yeah, unfortunately, it's just the way it works. I can't do that. Yeah, and it's even if we had the final exam in the exam period, it's the same situation. I've had classes where you have a class on Wednesday and then the final exam is on Friday, right? Like scheduled by the university or whatever. They only give you one study day between when classes end and when exams start. So, yeah. The good news here is hopefully, I don't know if you have other classes, but their exams might be later, like in the exam period. And so this one you can sort of, you're not going to be like studying for 3 exams at once. Like it's good to spread them around. So hopefully that helps you. And then it also gives you some distance between the project, because in other past years, projects were due at the end of class, but then everyone wants an extension. So I'm like, okay, hand it in, whatever, a couple weeks. But then it's like you have your final exam and then the projects are due the next day or something. And people like do their projects in one day after the final and things like that. So this way you have a nice gap. So anyways, I probably won't do it this way again. It was sort of a lesson learned, because I thought I could schedule in the last week of classes, but there's a policy against it. And so, yeah, I'll probably never do this again. But anyways, I think it doesn't disadvantage you at all. And you also have one less lecture of material to study for than in past years. Because in past years there would be, at least one more lecture. Usually we do a review class in the last lecture, so we drop one, but then the exam wouldn't be in class. So when we're now eating up 2 classes, one to write the exam and one to review the exam. And so, yeah.
For the assignment, when you mentioned that we could follow the same guidelines that you gave in class for the walkthrough of the tour, are you referring to the list here that you have in your paper?
Yeah, that's exactly right, yeah. So let me just put that on the screen just so that everyone knows what you're asking. So it's here. So yeah, so what I'm talking about and what you showed me is these guidelines here. And they're pretty general. They work well for any kind of software, and they're not even security specific, right? I would say that you could use these even if you were looking at Microsoft Word or something like that. And so I think they're probably pretty good, but yeah, I'm open to other suggestions. Other things? Okay. And these also, just for your interest, it's not something I made up. So I did this list was different than other lists and papers, but they are drawn from other papers. So the original paper on cognitive walkthroughs basically gives you the first 4. And then the other ones, there were a few papers. I forget where it was, but G8 was in one paper, so I just kind of pulled it in. And anyways, the list got a little bit bigger when I weaved together a couple different papers, but it's a pretty standard list. Okay, so we'll go back to where we were last class. So what I want to do is move into procedures. Procedures is another kind of gray area where it's hard to do technical analysis of it to make sure that your procedure is correct, that it achieves the properties that you want. It involves security, so almost all security has some procedure around it. We saw with social engineering as well, who has access to a room, who has the keys to it. There's some procedure or policy, company policy that's going to dictate that. So there is a lot of security where there's kind of 2 ways to attack a system. You can attack it from a technical level, or you can tackle it attack it sort of from the policy that's around access to it. So lots of courses you'll take lots in this degree are going to teach you all about the technical attacks, right? And so this is more about the policies and procedures. So the motivating example was airports, because it's something we're all familiar with and it's kind of complicated. And I will show you one attack, an escalation of privilege attack, because the policies weren't done correctly initially. So this attack worked 20 years ago, but it's fixed now. I know that it's fixed from firsthand experience. But yeah, it shows that it sort of shows how hard it is to get these things right. Okay, so we were walking through the airport, and so we showed up at the airport. We got our boarding passes. We got rid of our bags, and then now we're going to go in line. So we're going to wait for the security check. And before we even get to the security check, there's generally someone there that's watching you, and they're at the start of the line. They work for TSA, so that's the agency that's responsible to make airline travel safe. So that's their job. They're not law enforcement exactly. They're not border agents. So anyways, you show them your boarding pass. You don't have to show them your passport, so you don't really identify yourself. It's partly there as a convenience to make sure that you get to the right gate. They're going to track your movement through the airport, and they'll timestamp when you arrive. But then there is a secondary purpose to it, which is that they're actually going to try and screen you here. So the details of a program that was implemented in the USA, so not necessarily in Canada, was called SPOT. So I showed you last time some of the things that they use. So it's a scoring-based system. So if you get enough of a score, then they'll refer you to law enforcement. It's based on behavioral indicators. And so a question you might have is how successful was SPOT? So is this kind of thing even worth doing? The other thing I didn't mention is the screening agent needs to be trained. So they're trained in the SPOT, under the SPOT program. What are the identifiers? Like, they don't have that sheet of paper, and they're not like looking at you and looking at the sheet of paper, right? It's all in their head. And so they need to be able to identify things. Sometimes they do fancy things like allegedly, like they look at, there's this whole field of study of micro-expressions, which is that if you ask someone a question and they're going to deceive you, they may make a very, very fast expression on their face that they can't control, and before they deceive you, because they're aware of the fact that they're deceiving you. And it's not necessarily just at the start. It could be throughout the deception process, or if it looks like you're buying it, they might have like a brief indication of glee at you buying their story or whatever the case may be. And so there's people that spend a lot of time like training to identify these kinds of things. And anyways, it's really in that like kind of weird area of, is it actually science or is it not? And maybe it's science in the lab, but is it science that you can do in a real world setting like an airport? Who knows, right? So I'm not here to tell you that it's good or bad. I can tell you the success of the SPOT program because there were statistics that were released on it. So it looked like this. All right, so you screen whatever, 1 million passengers, okay? How many of them just went through so they didn't get enough points to do anything about it? The answer is 96%. And so that leaves 4% that were referred to law enforcement, which I'll write, LEO is the term they use, law enforcement organization. But basically it means police. Okay, so then they go to law enforcement, so that's fine. So then the police are going to interrogate them or maybe press charges or whatever. So there's going to be some procedure, and at the end the police will decide whether different people can fall out of that process at different points. So it could be that they interrogate them and they decide that there's nothing there. Could be that they're charged them and then the prosecutor decides not to charge them. Could be that it goes to trial and they're found innocent, whatever the case may be. But only a certain percentage will go all the way to like a conviction where they're convicted or they plea to an actual crime. And so there's another of this 4%. 96% were, we'll call them false positives. So for whatever reason, law enforcement didn't take an action, or it didn't lead to a conviction. Which leaves a 4% of the initial 4% where there was actually some sort of charge, or I can't remember if it's a charge or a conviction, but. Okay, so what do these charges look like, or like what's the crime, or what went wrong? So remember that this is TSA, right, that's doing this. And so TSA is just about airline safety. And so the general thing that they're looking out for is terrorism. So that's the one kind of charge. Things that they wouldn't care about, or it's not their mandate to care about, but turned out to sort of encompass a lot of this 4%, are people traveling that are undocumented or not allowed, basically, to travel. And then there's like a miscellaneous other crimes, maybe drug related or something like that. All right, so the undocumented accounted for 90% of this 4% of the 4% of the people. Miscellaneous was 10%. And then if you're doing your math in your head right, terrorism was 0%. So they didn't catch a single terrorist using this program. So anyway, so it was, I think we can say it was unsuccessful at its original purpose. It was criticized, and we don't know if it's still in effect or not, if there's some version of it or what they do. We're not sure. Okay, now pre-screening happens with an agent at the start of the security line. The other form of pre-screening that we don't know a lot about is that we know airports have a lot of surveillance, right? And we know that there's facial recognition technologies and things like that. Airports themselves will use them sometimes. Okay, so that's supposed to say unsure of implementation, but my thing's not working very well. So we don't know basically to what extent these things are used or not. Facial recognition is controversial. In fact, just this week, Facebook announced that it was killing one of its projects that it developed for facial recognition because there's so many problems with it. It's definitely the case that there's people watching the security tapes, right? So even if you do something weird or unusual and there's no screening agent there to observe it, there's probably a security camera and someone watching. But to the extent that which machines watch instead of humans, we don't know. So I would imagine, it would surprise me if they aren't using facial recognition or other kinds of machine learning, visual learning, but I can't prove it or say anything about it. Okay, so we then wait in line. And so now we're ready to go to the actual security. Okay, so the security screening, once again, it's the same people, the CT, TSA. So they're concerned about airline safety. And what do you show them? So obviously you're going to put all your items, you're going to empty your pockets, take your shoes off, all that stuff, put it in boxes. It's going to go through the x-rays. So you're going to dispose of your items. Do you have to show them your passport, boarding pass, anything like that? Okay, so they always check your boarding pass, but they don't check your passport. Why is your boarding pass important? Half of it is for the same reasons that they check your boarding pass when you get at the start of the line. They just want to track you through the airport. So they're like, okay, now the person's through security, and that was 5 minutes ago, and it takes 7 minutes to walk from there to the gate. So they're going to be here in 2 minutes or whatever. So that's the main reason that you show it. The other thing is that which line you get in could depend on what's printed on your boarding pass. So especially in the U.S., they have different lines for different. Depending on different indicators they have about you, they'll print something on your boarding pass that allows you to go to one line as opposed to another line. So they check it. But the main thing anyways is the items that you're carrying. So it's the search. Of you and your items. Okay, so your items go through an X-ray machine. And if they see something like, say it's in a bag or something like that, then they might want you to open your bag up. So they might want to search your bag. So I've had my bag searched lots of times. Sometimes it's like, oh, you have a book. I remember one time they're like, oh, you have a textbook in your bag. Like, yeah, we always look at it. And it made no sense to me. I'm like, what? What does a textbook have to do? But anyways, maybe it blocks the X-ray, or it was just an excuse because they were searching everyone. That was the day it was really slow going through security, so there might have been some incident. But anyways, and then when they search you, there's a couple different ways. So one is you might walk through a metal detector. What else? What are the other ways? Okay, so there's a pat down. What else? So pat down's usually when you opt out of something else. So if you don't want to walk through the metal detector, you're out of luck. But they also have an X-ray machine, like the one where you go and you stand and put your hands above your head. So that's a full body scan, this newer technology. And there they'll let you opt out of that, and usually you get patted down if you want to opt out. Why would you want to opt out of it? The two main reasons. Some people are concerned about cancer or things like that, like the health, basically, of getting the X-ray. And then other people don't like it because it's privacy invasive. So it shows basically you, your body shape nude to whoever is monitoring the system. And so airports actually implemented some procedures around that. So the person that's looking at the screen isn't allowed to actually see you. So they're not allowed to see you and say, oh, that person's about to go through, and then look at the scan of you. So they're supposed to be in a separate room with a wall, so they don't actually see the person. They just see the scans. They don't actually see what the people look like in real life. And that was a sort of privacy policy that anyway, some people think is adequate and some people don't. Another thing they do is sometimes they have these round discs, and it's on a stick, and they rub it on your belt, or they open your bag and rub it through your bag. So these are chemical swabs. And what they're looking for is almost certainly bomb-making materials. So if you get something on you, or if you're making a bomb, it's easy to get small trace amounts on you, and so it will detect it. It's also possible that they're looking for illicit drugs. I'll put in question mark. I don't think it is the case, but I'm not 100% sure. Sometimes you have dogs. They'll go around and they'll sniff your bags. Sometimes this happens in line. Sometimes there was one airport. It was they actually did that instead of walking through metal detectors or anything like that. So like they made us all line up and have our bags sitting beside us, and then they just walked around with a dog, and then they're like, okay, go. That was sort of unusual, but anyway, so same thing. The dogs are good at sniffing chemicals, and so they're looking for bomb-making chemicals and perhaps drugs as well. And also, different people have dogs in airports too. So TSA may use them, but law enforcement might also be using them, or border agents might use them. And so different agencies might have dogs that are doing different things. So like border services, they're more concerned about you bringing prohibited items across the border. So that would be illicit drugs, but it could be food. It can be like, even if you have like plants and things like that that might have different like parasites and things like that are local to a certain region, they don't want you to bring that into Canada because it might infect things here. And so border agents will take away lots of different things. If you bring fruit and stuff like that from different countries and stuff like that, they're going to try and stop that from coming across. Yeah, no problem. Okay, prohibited items. Okay, what are you not allowed to carry on in your carry-on luggage? Okay, so liquids. First off, just to get it out of the way, they're mainly looking for like things like weapons, bombs, etc. So that's the kind of thing. Okay, so let me list drugs here. Drugs, cash, maybe like fake identities, that kind of stuff. So in this case, it's not their job to find this stuff, but if they find it, they'll report it. So it's not TSA's job, but we'll report it. Okay, so liquids. So I think the current restriction is bottles have to be less than 100 ml. And then there's usually a restriction on how many bottles you can bring. Like all your bottles have to fit in a certain bag, like a Ziploc bag. Sorry, say it again. Duty free, right? Yeah, so the reason is that, so let's talk about it. So are all liquids banned? Does that mean there's no possible way that you could have a bottle with more than 100 ml liquid in it? So one exemption, so there's all sorts of exemptions to the rule. Okay, so the duty-free stuff, they search on its way in. So you would purchase that in the secure zone of the airport, and that search would happen, like even for that bottle of liquor to get into the airport, there would have been a search procedure for it. So that's why it's considered a safe item. If you buy it in one airport and then you transit in another and you have to go through security again, they're not going to let it through. Probably. Sometimes they seal it and they put like a sticker or something on it, but generally speaking, like you need to buy it like before your final destination and not anytime sooner. So that's why, so it's already in the safe zone, so it's already inspected. And because it's from a trusted manufacturer, they're less worried about it than they are about like some random individual they've never seen before bringing a large amount of liquid through. Also, first off, why aren't you allowed liquids? Why can't you take a bottle of water on the plane through security?
Maybe chemical product, maybe solution, the water, for example, drugs, maybe, and also maybe something for explosion.
Okay, so it's 100% about bombs. So someone once tried to make a liquid bomb and get it through security, so then they said, okay, no more liquids. That's essentially what happens. And that's almost always the story with TSA stuff. It's always like one person tried to do one thing once, and then they changed the policy. So that's why. Okay, is there any other exemption? Is there anything else that you can say it louder?
Sharp objects.
Sharp objects, yeah. So we can put that with weapons, bombs. So that includes things like I had a Swiss Army knife once taken away. Okay, are there other exemptions though? Is there other ways to get liquid onto a plane? Say again? E-cigarettes are also, they're prohibited. So there's a bunch of things that are like likely to explode, and so that's one. And actually, I shouldn't say that they are banned. I actually don't know. Does anyone know? It sounds reasonable that they are, but actually, I'm not sure. Maybe you can take them on. But if you have like aerosols and like that kind of stuff, I'm pretty sure that that's all banned. It's all prohibited as well. Okay, other exemptions?
It says TSA allows larger amounts of medically necessary liquids, gels, and aerosols in reasonable quantities for your trip, but you must declare them to TSA officers at the checkpoint for inspection.
Okay, so there's some medicine. So if you have like some prescription or something like that, you can get. Is there anything that you could just walk on? You don't need a prescription or anything like that. All right, so the first exemption is.
What about the baby?
Perfect. All right, so I once flew with my kid. You're allowed to bring as much baby formula or breast milk. And you can bring as much as you want. We brought a lot, right? So, and it can be as big as you want. So normally it's not like big. They're not usually in 100 ml or more, but you might bring a carton or something like that. And so that's totally exempt. Okay, so if you want to make a bomb, now you might want to have a baby with you, right? It might look weird if you have it without a baby, but yeah. Something even more benign that you don't need a baby for is contact lens fluid. Why, I don't know. I think maybe because it just always comes in big bottles, because it doesn't make sense. Like it's at a weird price point where it doesn't make sense to like buy a smaller bottle. But for whatever reason, this is exempt. So there's a very famous security person. His name's Bruce Schneier, and he doesn't like a lot of TSA rules. And so him and a journalist, they did a whole bunch of things that just to show like some of the loopholes. So they printed off fake boarding passes, and they were able to. They weren't able to change their seats because you have this collision problem where two people end up in the same seats. But they were able to change it so that they could skip the TSA line and they could go into TSA pre-approved, even though they weren't. And then he also, like just for fun, he brought 2 bottles of contact lens fluid. And then the person actually asked him, they're like, you're allowed to bring 1, or you're allowed to bring 2, but it's unusual that you bring 2. So he's like, why do you have 2 of them? And he's like, because I have 2 eyes. So anyways, they let him through. So another thing, if you want a bomb, like a liquid bomb, just put it in a contact lens fluid bottle. So it's kind of silly that you have all these restrictions, but then you have exemptions, right? Okay. What else do you have to do? Something that I think you still have to do in Canada, although you don't have to do in the US, or maybe vice versa. You have to do in the U.S. but not here. Is your shoes. So what do you do with your shoes?
Yeah, they check the shoes sometimes.
Yeah, you take them off generally. So is that here or in the U.S.? I can't remember. It's been so long. Yeah, so in the U.S., yeah. So when you fly through the U.S., they always make you take off your shoes. Now, I always do it anyways just because I can never keep it straight whether I'm supposed to or not. Okay, why are you taking off your shoes? I mean,
But I think
you take off your belt because it's going to trip the metal detector. You take off your watches and things like that. Assuming you have no metal in your shoes, why do you have to take them off?
I heard in Israel or maybe United States, someone put the bomb inside the shoes.
Exactly. So there was a shoe bomber once.
Yeah.
And because this one shoe bomber once tried to put a bomb in a shoe and actually got it on the plane and then was fiddling around with the shoe. And then someone, like another passenger, intervened and they stopped him from detonating it. And it wasn't even clear whether there was enough explosive in it to do anything substantial. But anyways, thanks to that one person, now everyone takes their shoes off ever. So that's also been criticized too, that some of these policies are very reactionary, right? So it's just like, well, one person did this once, so now forever we're going to take our shoes off. But we're not thinking about what's the next attack. It's always like, what was the thing that someone tried in the past? So that's the criticism is like Bruce Schneier's term for it is security theater. So it kind of makes you feel secure because you're taking your shoes off and you're in the airport and you're less stressed out because you think security is going really well and they're really checking everything. They're checking everyone's shoes, but really it's like kind of theater, right? Like you can. They're checking your liquids, but you can bring contact lens fluid on or whatever. And you can't put a shoe in your bomb or a bomb in your shoe, but you could put it in some other piece of clothing that you don't have to take off. So yeah. Another thing in that category is what else? Is there something else? I'll just give you a hint. What do you have to always take out of your bag? So you put your bag on the conveyor belt, but they're always like, oh, make sure you take out laptop, right? Or a tablet or any kind of phone or something like that and put it in a separate bin, right? So why is that?
Not to turn on it because they think something. Because I think the same electronic things they use for the bomb.
Okay, yeah. So first off, this is about bombs, finding bombs. And so you could hide a bomb in a laptop. Okay, so that's the first concern. The second concern is that a laptop looks like a bomb when you look at it through an X-ray. Has a lot of the same components like wiring and things like that. And so if you had a bomb behind behind your laptop in a bag, then it might all look like it's part of the laptop and you wouldn't necessarily see that they're separate items. So they could cover up a bomb, or they could actually be a bomb themselves. And so, yeah, as mentioned, sometimes they make you turn them on as well. So they want to see that it's a functioning laptop. So let's say I have a laptop and I turn it on and it works, it boots up. That cannot possibly be a bomb, right? Okay. So if you've seen like some of the laptops from 10 years ago, right? They're pretty thick, and look at the laptops now, they're pretty thin. You could put the electronics from a thin laptop into a thick laptop and you'd have a lot of space. You'd have probably another entire laptop full of space left to put your bomb or whatever you want to do. So the fact that it turns on doesn't, it proves that it's not completely non-functional, But you don't need a lot of electronics just to make the screen fire up. And it wouldn't even have to be a fully functioning laptop. It could just be enough that it turns on like a screen or something like that. So you could have a little Arduino chip or Raspberry Pi or something like that that would just make it turn on, and then the rest of the space you can use for whatever you want. Okay. Any questions or comments or remarks or stories about going through security? Okay. The next step is depending on how you fly. So if you fly domestically, you don't have to go through customs. You're off the plane. You're done. If you fly internationally, you may do customs after you land. That's most traditional. And if you fly to the, say, the US from Canada, then you'll actually do customs in Canada first. And then when you land in the US, you'll just be released. So customs can happen at different stages or not at all, but I'll just put them here as if we're flying to the US from Canada. Okay, so in this case, you're actually interacting with someone different. For example, if you're flying to Canada, you would interact with the Canadian Border Services. What do you show them? So what do they want to see? Do they want to see your passport? 100%, right? Do they want to see your boarding pass? Usually they'll look at it, but it's not as important. Usually they're looking at it because they want to know where you're coming from and what stops you had along the way and things like that. Yeah, so they sort of want your story of where you're coming from. And they certainly will treat you different depending on where you're coming from in terms of your flight. And the passport is essential as well. Okay. Usually there's a domestic line. So if we were flying into Canada, going to Canada Border Services, then people holding a Canadian passport would use one line, and people holding a passport from outside of Canada would use another line. Sometimes the US is sort of in that middle zone where they might go with the Canadians or not, because there's a bunch of treaties and things like that. The Canadian side is usually less, like, you don't necessarily even talk to a person. So you might just go to a terminal, fill out your information, and then they usually have one person that's kind of screening. So when you leave, you sort of hand them the form, and then but they might not ask you something, or they might ask you something, right? So there's the option that they ask you something, but they're not going to necessarily ask you something. But generally, if you're flying into with an international passport, you will talk to someone anyways, and they're at least going to ask you some questions about where you're coming from, where you're going, why you're here, that kind of thing. So in addition to the passport and boarding pass, they might want travel documents. They might want to know, hey, you booked a hotel and how long you're staying and things like that. In extreme circumstances, they might ask for a phone or electronic device. I'll just write phone. Are you legally compelled, say in Canada, if the CBS takes you aside, do you have to give them your phone? So you do, basically. And if they ask you what's the PIN or password to unlock it, you have to unlock it for them. Or you face criminal charges if you don't do it.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I don't understand. If they want to use, they want my phone password, they have to give them?
Yes. Yeah, so you have to. This was a thing that was controversial. And like, say you have an encrypted hard drive. Like, do you have to give them the decryption keys?
No, just one.
Yeah, but yes. So the answer is yes.
If the person is Canadian.
Yeah. So I think so. Yeah. So if you're pulled into secondary screening, even if you're Canadian, and yeah, there's no. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. I'm sure. So I can't. Don't quote me on this 100%. This is my understanding. But yeah, I'm not a lawyer. Yeah. Okay. So what are customs? Why are they there? What are they looking for? Okay, are they looking for bombs?
No.
Not so much. Okay, you're usually already off the flight, and if you're not, if you're doing a pre-screening, you went through TSAs. Okay, so I don't care about bombs. Do they care about whether you're a terrorist?
No.
So they do to an extent. So the no-fly list and those kinds of checks, they also care about as well. So there will be some anti-terrorism kind of things, and they might question you about, like usually they'll flip through your passport. If they see a stamp from a certain country or whatever, they might ask more questions or move you to secondary screening. So it's a more general anti-terrorism, not necessarily a bomb threat, which would be handled by the screening. They care. These are the people that care about drugs. Okay, so if you have drugs, and that includes. So sometimes the rules about drugs change, right? So if I'm flying into the U.S., their rules about marijuana are different than Canada, for example. So it's usually the policies both of where you're coming from and where you're going. It's kind of like the most restrictive of the two of them. There's lots of other things that they look for. So one thing is large money, amounts of money. So you're not allowed to carry, generally the rule is $10,000 in cash or more. That might differ based on the country, but that's sort of the general rule that's used a lot. Like I say, there's a lot of food items and things like that. And maybe you made purchases and you have to pay duty or taxes on them in order to bring them in, that kind of stuff. And you're only allowed to bring like one bottle of liquor across, and you're only allowed to bring if you're gone for like 24 hours, you can purchase like, I forget what it is now. It used to be like $200 or something like that. And so, it's not that you can't bring the stuff back, but you have to pay duty on it in some cases. Some cases you just can't bring it, and sometimes you got to pay duty. So that's another thing that they're looking for. The main thing they're looking though for is if you're coming to Canada to travel, are you actually coming to stay, right? So they're looking for illegal immigration. Yeah. So there's actually, I don't know how much of interest this would be, but there's a show, it's like really cheesy, but like a reality show of Canadian Border Services. I can't remember the name of it. Maybe someone can look it up or something. But anyways, it's actually pretty interesting. So every episode, there's like 4 or 5 cases of things that go through. And so sometimes they're meant to be funny, right? And sometimes they're more serious. So a lot of them are, around illegal immigration. And so like they'll take your phone and you'll be like, oh, I'm staying. They're like, what are your plans? Like, where are you staying? And then they'll be like, well, do you have a hotel book? And the person will be like, no, I don't. I'm going to stay with a friend. And then they'll be like, okay, where's your friend? Show me all the emails between you and your friend and like where you were planning for you to stay. And then they don't have them. And then they call the friend and they're like, this is like Canada Border Services. We understand this person's coming to visit you. And they're like, oh, no, like I hired them. Like they're my nanny. They're coming or whatever, So these searches, like they have a lot of power. So like the power of search at the border is like, it's even stronger than most law enforcement would have. Like if they just pulled you over on the street or things like that, they can, So there's also some criticism of how much power they have. But anyways, so you see that firsthand when you watch the show. And then there's a lot of things like people bring fruit, like fancy fruit from like say an Asian country where you can't buy the fruit here and it's prohibited and they don't realize it usually. Sometimes they try and smuggle it even though they realize it. So that stuff gets thrown out. And other weird stuff like bones, human remains. So like sometimes people will they'll get a skull like from as an artifact or an antique like for display, and so like that you can't bring across. And yeah,
Also,
bones
no wood.
or wood, yeah. So wood is kind of like plants. So if there's certain kinds of parasites or things in the wood that it could transfer, that's also restricted. And so, anyways, it's an interesting show. You see, it's different than what you think. You think they're just doing drugs all day, and they do find lots of drugs as well, but they find lots of other stuff. Okay, so finally, we're through. We're ready to board the flight. What do you do right before you board the flight? So you wait in line, you look at your boarding pass, it says, this is another thing that could get faked, so if you fake your boarding pass, you could give yourself priority boarding. Probably no one's going to notice that it's wrong. Maybe when they scan the boarding pass, it shows up on the screen as different, I'm not sure. So you wait in line, whatever, and then what do? You just walk onto the plane? Do you have to talk to anyone before you walk on the plane? Sorry? Okay, so whatever. Okay, so I just left security. So I pick up my bags, I put my belt back on, I put my shoes back on. I check the gate, and then I walk to the gate, and now my flight is boarding. Do I have to do anything else, or can I just walk on the plane?
No, you have to check in with the airline worker.
Okay. So when we board flight, there's one final check. And as you say, this is with the airline. Okay, so this isn't a TSA person, a border person, a law enforcement person. It's the airline itself.
I think the last thing they checked, the passport. They checked the passport or something like that.
Yeah, okay, so that was my next question. So what do they actually check? So obviously they want to see your boarding pass just to make sure that you're on the right flight. Do they check your passport or identity?
Passport.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, they do check your passport now. You might not know this, but if you're Canadian and let's say I'm Canadian and I flew to Vancouver, which is in Canada, do I have to show a passport? I don't. I just can show a driver's license or something like that. So if I'm flying internationally, it's a passport, and domestically, it's identity, some sort of ID card. So I've done that before where I've flown to Toronto and just with my driver's license. It's weird. Like everyone just shows their passport anyways, but technically you don't have to. And then, they basically say, you can board or no. And they also check, this is also critical, is the name. It's sort of obvious, but is the name on the passport equal to the name on the boarding pass? Okay, now pretend that they didn't check. Right? You've used your passport before, you've used your boarding pass. Lots of people have looked at those two documents throughout this whole process. How bad would it be if they didn't check? Like, who cares? It's just the airline, you're going on the plane.
Maybe
Maybe
they have the boarding pass with you.
Maybe he swapped his passport. Or
Okay, so there's some...
Person like that.
Okay, so maybe there's some swapping of things, but other people check your passport and things like that, right?
when we board the flight, they'll only check the boarding pass.
Okay, so let's say that is the case. So it's no longer the case. It actually was that case like 20 years ago. They would only check the boarding pass, but now they do check your ID with your boarding pass. But my question is, what if they just checked your boarding pass? So if we rewind in time 10, 20 years ago. So who else checks your passport? So customs check your passport, but let's pretend you're not going through customs. So you're just flying domestically. What about the security thing, security screening? No, they just check your boarding pass, right? The pre-screening people, they just check your boarding pass. Okay, if we go back, I can show up at the airport and not have to talk to a human. I can log in online and do all that stuff, get a ticket, sticker for my bag, and all that stuff. So I can, if I'm carrying on luggage, I don't even have to check a bag. And so I don't have to show my passport at any stage before I enter the security line, right? I do have to show it, or at least give the information when I book my ticket, but that's to the airline themselves. right? So the airline, basically the airline's the only people. TSA never really look at my passport. And border services do, but they're not necessarily involved. Law enforcement don't look unless if they have to get involved for some other reason, okay? So it turns out that if you look at this procedure, it's hard to see, like it's hard for you to say why it's so important for this ID check at the airline, okay? And so it was so hard to see that for a long time they didn't check it and there was an actual attack. And so someone discovered it, and it just shows you how hard it is to sort of get policies right. But it turns out that that check is kind of critical to the whole system. So in step 7, what if the airline doesn't check your identity? It turns out that this is critical. And it stops an escalation of privilege attack. Which worked, maybe 20 years ago. All right, so this attack was pointed out by a security researcher named Chris Segoyan. He had his front door kicked down by the FBI because he posted how to do this on the internet. Okay, and so the idea of this attack was, let's say you're on the no-fly list, you shouldn't be able to fly, right? So but if there's no security around boarding passes, like there was no signature, digital signature, or anything like it, he showed that even if you're on the no-fly list, you can fly. Even if you can't fake a passport. So one way is you could just fake your passport and take on someone else's name. In his case, he said, even if you can't fake a passport because that's hard, if you can fake a boarding pass, because that's pretty easy, you can do it with a computer at home. You can print it out. You can now have a QR code or something like that. So no one's checking the authenticity of it. They're just scanning it, right? And you can change all the information in it. Then that's enough to fly, even though you should be on a no-fly list. Okay, so basically the attack works like this. First, you book a ticket under someone else's name. And then you create 2 boarding passes. So you get your boarding pass 1, which is in the false name. And then you have boarding pass 2, which is in your real name. Okay, now because you booked the ticket under the false name, then this is when the no-fly check happens. So you'll pass that. Okay? But if you book it under the false name and you show up, so I have my real passport. I should say that too. I have a passport, but it's real. Then it's up to someone basically to take my passport, right? Look at it, and then ask for my boarding pass, which is fake, right? Because this is a real, like I booked it under the false name, so the boarding pass that's in the same false name is actually the real. Sort of confusing. So this is the real boarding pass, and then this is the fake boarding pass. Okay. So if I show someone these two items, right, they're consistent with each other. Okay. But the boarding pass is fake. But the only person that knows the boarding pass is fake is potentially the airline, because they could look up that information and see that there's no one with that name flying. Okay. But TSA or border services or whoever else, they don't have access to the airline database. So they're just looking for consistency between the two documents. Similarly, if I showed someone this, just this, the boarding pass with the false name, that does match the database. Okay? So the idea is, can I walk through this whole song and dance, and every time I talk to the airline, I want to show them boarding pass 1 and hope that they don't want to see my passport as well, because I don't have a passport that matches it. And every time I talk to someone else, I show them the fake boarding pass and the fake fake boarding pass in my real name and the passport in my real name. Okay, and so the only time you get caught if you stare at this procedure is actually at this last step. That's where you have to show a boarding pass that, you know, that to the actual airline that has that information, and you have to show your passport with it, and so they should match. Okay, so the name on the passport needs to match on the boarding pass, and then maybe I should add as a second check that the flight information exists. So like there actually is a person with that name on the flight. So if you skip the passport at this stage, then there's no one else that that can see basically your passport, your boarding information, and has access to the airline database to see that boarding information is correct. So law enforcement, TSA, border services, etc. They were just seeing your passport and your boarding pass. And the airline, in this case, because they weren't checking your passport when you boarded, they were seeing these two pieces of information. Okay, but you would have to see all three of them to see that they're all consistent with each other. Then you would say that this is a fake person. So for the TSA, you show your real passport and boarding pass 2. And because TSA doesn't talk to the airlines, they can't check. They're also not checking the no-fly list at that point in time, or at least that's the assumption. and then the airline, we're just looking at the boarding pass and flight info. So you would show them the boarding pass number 1, and they would check the flight info, and they'd say, oh yeah, we have that person on the plane, but they're not checking the passport to see that you are that person. Okay, so that's a totally different person. All right, so this issue is completely fixed now, I would assume. So it's fixed by the airline checking the passport before you board. And there could be more information sharing now. So I don't know if that's the case, but it wouldn't surprise me now if TSA could look up flight information, or they could check the no-fly list or things like that. Everything's electronic. They have those like electronic scanners and things like that. So there's a lot more. Remember, like 20 years ago, things were electronic, but it wasn't like in the cloud electronic, right? So like different, like Air Canada would have their system and their network, but it wasn't easy to share that information with the government or whoever wanted it. So there's probably more information sharing today. Okay, and so the lesson from this are, first off, so procedures are hard to get right. And there was some attempts, I've seen attempts of people trying to take a procedure like this and convert it into math or logic is probably a better way of putting it. So it's called formal analysis. And so you write down rules formally, like, and then you can check certain or you can get a computer to basically check that there's no way through this whole procedure without, you know, if this person has a fake name or whatever, like there's no way that they can get through. And so that's how you could check for these EOP. But formal methods is like, first off, it has to be a custom fit. Like someone has to model this exact situation. Okay, so it's not like there's a general tool and you can just plug in your situation. It's like someone has to sit down and they have to say, okay, who are the different parties that are involved and what's the information that's involved and who talks to who and who checks what, and they have to model it all like custom for the airport. So if it's the government of Canada trying to make sure airline procedures are correct, then that makes sense, right? They can spend a bit of time on it. But if it's your company and you have 5 employees and you're trying to figure out who has access to the server room, and you're trying to write down a policy that makes sense, then you're not going to use formal methods in order to do it. And the other thing about formal methods is it only captures everything that you model. So if you forget something, or there's some assumption that's sort of external and you didn't capture it, whatever you don't capture, it can't cover. And so that's the other thing about it. It's easy to leave out assumptions. So it only models what you actually model. But anyways, it could help. But it's not a general, like, great solution to the whole problem. So people look at formal methods for, like, there's 2 ways. You could actually develop a formal method, and you can also, like, just write down what the rules are and then just randomly try things. So, like, you couldn't do this in a procedure setting like this, where you would just like give people random passports and boarding passes and just make them walk through. Imagine you could get 1 billion people and do that and just walk them through and see who makes it out the other end, right? You can't do that obviously in the real world, but you can do that with a computer system. So if there's some policy like certificates, there was all these checks, like is it valid, is it not, is it supposed to be a CA certificate or not, is it not expired, is it revoked, blah, 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 blah. What you could do is you could create millions or billions of mutant certificates and just throw them at the software and see if any of your fake certificates make it out the other end, right? So this is called fuzzing. So that's another thing that you can do, but it doesn't work on human procedures. It only works on like kind of software kinds of procedures, including the one that we'll talk about next, which is called the same origin policy. But we'll talk about it after a short break. So why don't you come back around 10 after 7? And yeah. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears. This is still a policy, okay, and I'm going to present it to you from the perspective of a policy. So this is a policy that goes back to the 90s. The people that were designing browsers back then, they worked at Netscape, and so they had to design a policy around certain issues that arise in browsers. It seems like more of a technical problem because it's computers making decisions about computer stuff, but it's still a policy in the sense that there was no right or wrong answer, right? So they chose to do it one way. You could have done it a different way, and maybe it would have been a better web or a worse web, who knows? But you would have a different set of issues anyways. So depending on which way you went in terms of the policy. Okay, so this is a policy that's in your browser. And then I'll show its consequence on attacks. Like, we'll look at things like cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery. This is stuff you will see in 6.130 or 40, I can't remember which one. But there it's more about like, how do we attack the system? I want to show it from a different angle of like, how was it that the policy allowed this attack to take place? And then how do you fix it given what the policy, like could you change the policy? And then what's the consequences of changing the policy? And then if you don't want to change the policy, like how can you sort of get around it in a way that's compliant with the policy yet solves the problem that you see? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so all of this stuff concerns websites that weave content from multiple sources. Right, which is basically the case in the modern web. So like almost all modern websites do this to some extent, even very simple pages. And it concerns basically how are you going to isolate, first off, who's responsible for what resources? And is there any isolation between them? Okay, so the source is called an origin, so that's where same origin comes from. So origin is just a fancy word for like where you got it from. So you got it from Google, you got it from Facebook. They're different origins, but we're going to have a more technical definition of what it means. So if you get something from Facebook over HTTPS on one port and you get something else from Facebook, but it's not over HTTPS and it's on a different port, is that the same origin or different? Sorry?
Protocol, subdomain, and port.
Yes, yeah. So I'll write it out. But yeah. That's basically it. Yeah. So we'll say like how do you actually define what an origin is and not? And then what does that apply to? And then what are the consequences of it? Okay, so this was a policy. It's actually, there's a set of two policies that are closely related to each other. So we'll talk about both of them. So this was standardized by Netscape in the late 1900s. So in 94, they came up with a policy for cookies. And then in 1995, they came up with the policy that we'll talk about, but I'm going to talk about both of them, which is the same origin policy itself. And a lot of the ideas that are in the cookie policy are in the same origin policy as well. So there's a lot of commonality, including defining what an origin is, basically looks the same. You need to know what an origin is to set a cookie policy. So this was based on this. Maybe I'll draw the arrow the other way around. So that's why we'll talk about both of them. And the same origin policy, as I said, it concerns resources. So resources are either active or passive. So active resources are things like JavaScript. It's the most common one. Could be things like CSS, and then there's other older stuff that's not used so much, like Flash and ActiveX and that kind of stuff. And then passive resources are HTML, JPEGs, MP4 videos, whatever, that kind of stuff.
But are cookies considered active or passive?
So they're not content. So they're not a resource. So they're something. A resource is something that lives in the website itself, and then a cookie is something that your browser maintains on your behalf. So yeah. Okay, and so mainly it's going to concern active resources. Passive resources we don't really have a problem with. You kind of just weave everything together and say it belongs to the person who pulled it all in. But active resources get complicated. So just to illustrate it, just to get you thinking what the problem is. Let's say you have a website A, and there's some JavaScript and you want to run, and it's on website B. Okay, so you run it. That's fine. Now, is the JavaScript running in the context of website B? So if it says update a record, is it updating the record on website B because they're hosting the JavaScript? Or is it updating the record on website A because website A is telling your browser to go to website B and run that JavaScript? Okay, so so in this case, yeah. So the answer is it's in website A. So when it pulls the JavaScript down, it runs it in the context of website A, even though it's being hosted by website B. All right, and sometimes people don't realize that, and then there's consequences, cross-site scripting, and things like that. But anyway, so there needs to be a policy that sets that. Okay, it could have gone the other way. They could have said, when you run JavaScript, it runs in the context of whoever is hosting it. And then you would have a different set of security concerns. So this is sort of the same picture, I guess. But all right, so you have active and passive content, and then cookies. I would call it meta information. It's something that gets appended. It's not in the. It's on the outside of the envelope. That's not even a great analogy. But anyways, it's in the headers of the stuff that's being sent. It's not in the body of what's being sent. Whereas this stuff is in the body of it. So yeah, so if you have like website A, and then it loads, say JavaScript from B, and it loads a JPEG from C. Who owns it, who's in charge of it, when the JavaScript runs, what context is it running under? These are the things that that these policies are going to try and sort out. Okay. Excuse me. So you have certain security goals with this policy. So it's not just like a browser thing about functionality or can you build cool websites and things like that. You want to maintain some security goals. And so if we think back to Stride, there's basically the two things that are relevant from Stride is we want to prevent attacks due to tampering, and we want to think a bit about privacy as well, or information disclosure. So roughly in terms of tampering, what we want is what you see as the human looking at the website is what was actually sent by the server to your browser. And if you tell something to a particular origin, I know we haven't defined it yet, but if I tell Facebook something about something and Facebook's running something from Google, does that mean that Google learns about that information as well? So from a privacy perspective, we want, obviously if you tell the web something, someone has to learn that, okay? And so we want if you have a website where there's like A, B, C, and D all have content of it, it's got to go to someone, it's going to go to A, okay? So it's going to go to the origin, the website that you're actually on, and C, D, E, they're not going to learn about it, okay? So that's what we want. It's not always the case that is what ends up being enforced, but that's sort of the goal that we might want from a security perspective. So just as a motivating example, let's say that you don't see this so often, but like imagine you're on a website and you're going to log into like Facebook, but you're going to do it from like a frame inside that website. So like, yeah. So anyways, that's the best way of putting it. It's kind of a weird example, but anyways, if that frame inside is actually from Facebook, then when you type your password in and press enter, it will go to Facebook. It won't go to the site that made that frame that put Facebook inside that frame. Okay, so the idea of a frame itself has a certain policy around it. It says who the origin is that it goes to. And if you didn't embed it as a frame, if you embedded it as a script or something else, then the rules might be different. Okay, so like frames have one set of rules and scripts have a different set of rules, cookies have a different set of rules. Okay, so let's start with cookies first because chronologically the policy was developed first. And if we understand the cookie policy, then we'll see some commonality with the same origin policy itself. Okay, so what are cookies and where are they? So cookies, they're data or values, or let's just call them numbers. And they're stapled to an origin. And a label. So sounds weird. When we get into the details, I show some examples, it'll become clearer. But a cookie basically, so first off, it has an origin. So Facebook might set a cookie, so that's going to be attached to Facebook. And then the cookie itself is a value data pair. So it Facebook might choose to call their cookie session ID. So that's what it's called. And then the session ID data itself will be some number, right? So it might be a unique number that they give to you and they don't give to anyone else, okay? And then later, if you're on Facebook, they can say, hey, what was that cookie that was assigned to you? And give me the session ID cookie, and then your browser will say the number. And it's not even a question and answer between Facebook and your browser. Your browser actually staples it onto everything that's going outbound to Facebook. So we'll go through those details, but that's what a cookie looks like. And I'll show you too.
Cookies are an HTTP header?
Yes, yeah. Let me think.
They are.
Yes, yeah. Okay, I'm going to backtrack. So they are, when you are sending HTTP requests, they are in the header of the HTTP at that level. So they're not at HTML like at the application layer. But there are non-HTTP requests that you can make that also use cookies, that your browser will also put cookies on. So if JavaScript opens a connection to a website and gets content and pulls it down, it doesn't use HTTP. It uses a different protocol, but your browser will still put cookies in that. Yeah. So later we'll show that there's actually a flag in the cookie where you can say HTTP only. So it scopes it only to sending it when you're doing stuff over HTTP and not when JavaScript's asking for things. Yeah. But the question's more or less yes. The answer is more or less yes, but there's a bit of a nuance. Okay, so let's write that down. So they're in the header. Okay, so let's just walk through. So I think I asked this in a much earlier lecture, but let's say you go to Gmail, you log in, right? So you send your username, password. Now Google knows that you're you, right? And they show you your inbox. So that's great. Okay, so you're logged in, you're looking at your inbox. Then you click on the first message in your inbox because you want to read it. So now you go to Google and you say, hey, I want to see the first message in this inbox. How do they know it's you? Right? They know it was you in their first response because you authenticated, right? But do they ask for your username and password every time you click on something? They don't. So why? How is it that they know who you are? First off, if they know who you are at this stage, why did they even ask for your name and password before? Why don't they just never ask for your name and password?
They know our browser.
Okay. Any more specific ideas?
Maybe someone else use my computer.
So that's true. Someone else could use your computer. So what would happen in that case? So you could still be logged into your account, and when they go to Gmail, then they could read all your email. Certainly, yeah. But mechanically, how is it that Google recognizes you as being the same person that just logged in? Okay, so that's what a cookie does. So basically, when you log in, they say, okay, now I know it's you, right? And for future, I know that you're probably going to ask me for stuff in the future, so I'm going to give you a unique number. Okay, so let's think about the sunset of a cookie. So like, when does it go away? But just for now, like for the next 5 minutes at least, I'm going to give you a random number, okay? And you're going to have this random number, and it's unique to you. And every time I see that random number, right, then I'm going to believe that it was you and not. And so I won't ask you for your username and password again. Okay. Now, how does that random number? So I tell you your random number is 55. Okay. How do I know that you're the person with number 55?
I have a database as the backend.
Who's I in that case? So that's right. But
The server has a database.
okay, so the server says that Jeremy Clark logged in. I checked his password. It's all good. I gave him the number 55. Okay, so that's what Facebook knows or Google knows. They know that Jeremy Clark has 55. How does that 55 does it go to me?
They send it through the reply of the
Okay, so they send it through the reply. So that's great. Then what happens?
The browser also store that number.
Okay, so my browser is going to store 55. And it's going to say this was, so that's the cookie. So it's going to say this is a cookie from Google. It's 55. And then what? Then now I want to click on that first message.
With each action I do, I send the cookie. The browser sends the cookie.
Okay. So when I click on that first message, my browser says, hey, I see you're about to send a request to Google. Okay? Do I have any cookies that belong to Google? So what it will do is it will go in, they call it the cookie jar. So it will go through the cookie jar and it will look and it will see, oh, I have this cookie that number 55 that Google set. And so I'm going to send that back to Google. And that's going to happen on every request. Okay? So every request, I send 55 back. And then when Google sees the 55, it goes and looks up in its database and says, okay, I know who that is. That's Jeremy. I'm not going to ask him. Okay? Now, let's say I click log out. Okay, then what happens? What happens in this story?
The cookie should be destroyed.
Okay, so who destroys the cookie?
The server destroys, so the server must remove like 55 from Jeremy, then yeah.
So when you say it removes, sorry, that's right. Where does it remove it from? So the cookie's in two locations. It's in the server's database and it's in my cookie jar.
And the server
From
database.
the server.
Okay, what about my cookie jar?
It's there, but it's not safe.
Usually they put like like for the cookie they put like destroyed upon end of session. So when you end the session, it will go away.
But how
The
about-
cookie in the cookie jar will go away.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a reasonable answer, right? Any other ideas?
No, I don't
How
think
about
so. It's
clear
there. I
caching
think it's there.
technique?
Okay,
Sometimes it's
it could
needed
just
to-
be there.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
sometimes it's needed to clear the cookies cache and
Okay, so the user can always clear their cookies, right? So that's an option that's available to you at any time. So the answer is that they, first off, you can't actually delete a cookie. So this is a little known fact about cookies, but Facebook can't be like delete the cookie. They could set it to 0 or they could override the value, but they can't actually delete it or get rid of it. They do have an expiration date, so eventually they'll disappear. But other than that, you can't kill it. What they do is they actually don't delete it. They just don't honor it. So when you say log out, they drop from their database or they might say, this is Jeremy Clark. He's 55, but he's logged out. So ask him for the username and password. But your browser will keep sending 55 even though you're logged out. Google will just say, okay, I know what that is, and that person's logged out, and so I'm going to ask them for their username password. Okay? And then other things too, like say you move to a different IP address or things like that. Just because you have a cookie and that cookie's valid, it doesn't necessarily mean that Google's going to honor that cookie. Okay? So Google has a policy around their cookies and if you have a valid cookie, does that mean you get in always? Or am I going to look for other information? Like all of a sudden you're from a different country, like trying to log in, but you have the same cookie and things like that. So they might implement different things, right? Do I make you log in every time you close your browser window? Or do I let you stay logged in for 30 days? And is it 30 days as opposed to 60 days? All of those policies are all decided server side. Okay, so Google can implement whatever they want. Your browser just keeps stapling the cookie value in, and it's up to Google to try and decide what to do with it.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yeah.
For example, whenever we log in Amazon, for example, or e-commerce websites,
Mm-hmm.
then whenever we logged out and again log in, then again Amazon starts suggesting us according to our interests. Is it also work on top of cookies?
Yeah. So cookies. So yes. So cookies are the thing that lets them recommend things to you. You're saying that even when you're logged out, it still shows you relevant recommendations?
Again, when we log in, yeah.
Yeah. So usually because that cookie's set and it still gets sent, Amazon still knows it's you. They just know that you're logged out. They're like, oh, it's you again, but you're logged out. So if you try and do something like add something to a cart, I'm going to make you log in. It's not because I don't know who you are. It's just because you logged out. So I'm going to force you to log in. And then what happens, we'll talk about this later too, but let's say you're, I don't know, Facebook. Okay. So you set a cookie. Person comes to Facebook, they log in, you set a cookie. All right, so now you know who they are, you know their name, you know all their friends and that type of thing. And then let's say that user goes over to whatever, Reddit, and there's a Facebook like button. Okay, that's a script that Reddit choose to embed in their website from Facebook. Okay, so what that means is your browser will go to Reddit, it will say, give me the pictures and all that other stuff. And then it will say, oh, I'm supposed to go over to Facebook and ask for this script. So then you go over to Facebook and you say, give me the script. Now, what gets sent is your Facebook cookie. So your Facebook cookie, when you ask for that script, because that's a request going to Facebook, and you have something in your cookie jar that matches Facebook, your browser will be like, okay, I'm going to put this cookie in. Okay. So now this cookie goes over to Facebook. Now, let's say that Facebook, they have a script that they only use on Reddit, and they have another script on other websites and things like that. Right? So their scripts are customized. Now Facebook knows that you were on Reddit. They know maybe what subreddit you were on, right? It depends on how specific they want to get. They might know the referrer of like basically who referred them to Facebook. Okay? And so that's how that Facebook is able to track you across something like over 50% of the web, and Google like an even greater amount. I think Facebook was like 40% and Facebook or Google's like 80% or something like that. Google's really popular because they have like these web browser tools that let you, so because people Google for your website, what they'll do is they'll give you data. So they'll be like, this person found your website because they Googled this search term. And because they can track the user from the Google search engine to your website, and then they can even see like how long they stayed or whatever the case may be, that's useful for developers, and so they want all of that. And so they implement like, and it's just a line of code. You just copy and paste like, hey, grab this script from Google Webmaster Tools, and then it does all of this like magically, right? And they give you a lot of data about different things, but whatever Google knows about it that they're willing to share with you. But then you're also allowing Google to trace everyone around the web. So anyways, this is why like personal recommendations work. So you're looking at something on one website, and then you go to another website, and then you get ads for the website that you were just at. And yeah, none of that's random. And usually it's like Google, for example, they're an ad agency. So like one website will have Google by ads or ads by Google. So Google's supplying the ads, and they'll show you an ad from a website that also uses Google developer tools. And so they know that, oh, you were the person that was just on that website, or whatever the case. And it doesn't matter if you're logged in or not logged in. It happens anyways. Yeah.
The Google, when I opened the first email, the Google just checked the random number it gave me.
When you, okay, let's start really from scratch. So let's say you have a brand new laptop.
Yes.
You turn it on for the first time.
Yes.
You have no cookie, no number. Same if you open private browser mode. Okay, same thing. So you have no number. The first time you connect to Google, like even if you just go to the login page, you go to gmail.com, they're immediately going to assign you a unique ID. Even though you haven't logged in yet, they don't know who you are, you get that unique ID. And now they can start tracking you, right? And so even if then you navigate away from Gmail, you never log in, and you start going to other sites and looking at it, they're still like building up a dossier of all the websites that you're looking at. And then eventually when you come back and you do log into Gmail, then they're like, oh, now I know who this person actually is. So cookies aren't just, they were developed so that you don't have to type your username and password in all the time. Like for every action, you have to type your username and password in. That would be like a terrible web. But then they've been abused for like tracing people around the web.
If you use the same internet IP, for
Yeah.
example, and I copy the cookie from your system into my system, is it
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah, so you wouldn't even have to use the same IP. Like if I'm on my phone and I step outside, I go from Wi-Fi, Concordia's IP to Bell Canada's 5G IP address, right? And so it's total different IP, totally different network provider, but the cookie's the same, and it will keep me logged in.
If I steal the cookie.
Yeah, if you steal the cookie, you steal the person's session.
I can steal the Google Drive, everything.
Then you steal it. So, yeah, then it's up to, once again, the server's policy. So they have to think about what are they going to allow someone to do that just has a cookie. So some services you'll notice, like say you go in and you change the password, they might make you type the old password in. Why do they do that? They already know who you are. You typed it in, right? It's because they know it's easier to steal a cookie than it is to steal a password, right? Or if you, I don't know, you're on GitHub and you want to make a repository public or something like that, they'll be like, okay, you're logged in, we know who you are, but just, this is a sensitive operation, so we're going to make you log in again just before you do this kind of thing.
Or also can ask by trusted browsers, yeah?
So what do you mean by trusted browser?
For example, sometimes when we want to, for example, log into a website or application, there is a box that says this browser is 30 days trusted, for example.
Yeah. Okay. So that corresponds to two things. There's two different things that are mixed up in that idea. One of them is sometimes they want to like try and assess whether you're on a public computer. This is like not so common, but like back in the 90s or whatever, like people would go to the library because they didn't have a computer at home. They would log in, and it's not like they even had it's not like Concordia where you have a unique login, right? It's just like there's one person that's logged in. And so when you're done looking at your email, if you forget to click that log out button, then the next person that sits down to your computer, they get access to your email. And so you can say this is a public computer, then it's a little more strict. So it might time you out quicker. As soon as you close the browser window, even if you didn't explicitly log out, it will log you out. And by it will log you out, it won't delete the cookie, but the server will, actually, no, sorry. In that case, it will delete the cookie. So you can tell the browser when you close, get rid of this cookie. So that's usually what that setting does. It usually just kills it when you close the browser. And that's the browser actually removing that cookie because the server doesn't know when you close your browser. It's not like you send a message to the server saying, hey, I just closed my browser, right? It has no idea. So there's some policies around that. Now, the other question, the other time that this arises, which I think is more what you're talking about, is you have the same account, but you're accessing it from multiple devices, right? So I log into Amazon from my computer. I set a cookie. Now it knows my computer. Then I log in from my phone, completely different browser. So it doesn't have that cookie, right? And then it will say, oh, it looks like you're coming from a new browser. Do you want to trust it or whatever? And then it might ask for a confirmation from your other browser that it does have a cookie already set. Yeah. So that's usually when you have multiple devices that have different cookies and you're accessing the same thing. Yeah. So generally, if you have a session ID, like say I log in from my computer and I log in from my phone, Amazon could give me the same cookie on both, right? Because I'm the same person, but it won't. It will give me a unique cookie for my browser and a unique one for my phone because they also want to know how many times am I coming from this one device and how many times am I coming from the other device, things like that. Yeah. And then it can also look at like when I come from this one, when I always show up with this one cookie, I'm always asking for the website version of the website, right? Like the page that's rendered for like an iPhone screen and it's rendered for an iPhone 13. Right, like I want that dimension of the screen, right? Then they're like, oh, he has an iPhone 13 or whatever. And then the other one, it's like, oh, that's coming from Safari, right? Like maybe he's running Safari on Windows, probably not, right? And so anyways, there's all sorts of information that they can start piecing together then. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Okay, so let me try and draw out, like, because we said a lot of words. So let's just use the example of Google. Okay, so I get a brand new computer, just bought it, turn it on, very first time. Okay, I type in google.com, I press enter, what happens? So first, it's not important to cookies, but I'll go to DNS and I'll get the IP address for Google. So now I know where Google is. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to send a request. And the request could be for like index.html or whatever. And then I'll get a response from Google. And sorry, I just want to capitalize it because it looks weird not capitalized to me. Okay, so I get a response, and it's the website. It's the Google homepage, you know, with the search bar or whatever. And apparently they only have like, there's a certain number of words that are always on that website. So sometimes they change it, but they're not allowed to add words. I forget what it is. There's like 18 words that are always on that website or something like that. So I get the response, and the response is going to include, if they want to set a cookie, it will include an instruction, okay, to my browser, which says set cookie. And the cookie will be given a name. So session IDs are usually called SSID, but it doesn't have to be that. And then whatever, it's 55. Okay, so this is now my cookie. So then what my browser does is it says, okay, I just got a cookie, and so I need to store this information. So my browser is going to store it. So this is the cookie jar. And it's going to store who gave it to me. So that's called the origin. And we're going to have a detailed discussion of whether a cookie set by images.google.com is the same as a cookie that's set by search.google.com or mail.google.com. And so there's going to be a bunch of rules about that. And there's also some flexibility when you set a cookie with how you want it set. So I'm going to set those details aside for now, but let's just think at a very high level. This is kind of a Google cookie. So it's coming from google.com. And then the cookie has a certain value, SSID equals 55. Okay, then, so this is great. So I'm on Google. Now I want to log in, or I want to click on something or whatever. So to do that, I'm going to send another request to Google, right? I want an action done by Google. So I'm going to send another request. So my browser says, hey, there's a request. It's going out to google.com. I can see that. But before I send that request, I'm going to quickly check my cookie jar. I'm going to go by my cookie jar and take a look. And if I see any cookies that match google.com, I'm going to include them in the request. Okay? So it will go through the cookie jar and it will see, oh, I have this one cookie. It matches google.com. So I'm going to append it, or prepend it is a better way of putting it, to the header of the request. And then the rest of the request is the same. And then that goes across to google.com. Okay? So now google.com can say, the person who sent this and the person who sent this is the same person. Okay? And that's important because they have 1 million people that are trying to connect to them at all times. Okay? And so assuming that this is a unique ID. Now, to all the other questions, if anyone else sends a request with SSID equals 55, then Google will think that they're the same person as this. Okay? So if you want to hijack someone's session, it's sufficient to just take the SSID. Right? So cookies are never going to be 55. They're going to be a long, 60-digit character, 80 bits, 256 bits, something like that. Okay. Now, because cookies are so important, if I see it, then I can hijack your session. Are they sent over HTTPS? If they are they on the outside of the envelope or are they on the inside of the envelope? And can you send cookies not over HTTPS? Like what, are they encrypted? What do we think?
It depends
Okay.
on the attributes.
Okay, so there is something in the attributes that you can tell the browser about when to send it. That's a more advanced thing, so let's talk about that later. Is it possible that you send a cookie in clear text? Is that even possible?
Yeah.
So the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you access any website over HTTP, then your cookie is sent in plain text, and anyone that's in the middle can take that cookie value and they can hijack your session. Now, a lot of cookies aren't meant for critical things, right? They're meant to track you around. So if someone wants to steal your cookie, then they're going to think that your behavior is the same as the other person's or stuff like that. So a lot of cookies are kind of nonsense, like they're not that important. Or like if I increase the font on a website, then it will set a cookie to remember that I want that font on that website. So someone else could steal it and then they'll see the website as I want to see it with the increased font. But it's not like a security risk in that case. So sessions do a lot more than keep you logged in, right? So you can use cookies to do whatever configuration, anything that you want that's specific to the user. So they're most often used for logging in. So usually session ID actually means like a login. That's kind of like a login security credential. They're often used for site configuration. So if you want to configure the site to look a certain way and you want it to stick, so every time you come back to that website, it always looks a certain way, then cookies are used for that. And then cookies are also used so that would be like a session ID kind of scenario. Oh yeah, for tracking. So like you want to harvest data on users as well. So those are probably the three most, like the biggest cases of where they're used. Okay, so the question of whether they're encrypted or not. Basically, if the website itself response, so if the response comes over HTTP, then no, they're not encrypted. And if the response comes over HTTPS, then they are encrypted. That's not even an obvious answer because we know in HTTPS some things are encrypted and some things aren't, right? Like the destination is not encrypted because the packet has to get there. Okay, but the answer is yes. It's in the envelope of encryption. So headers are covered by encryption. And just pure trivia on that point, it's actually why they changed the name from SSL to TLS. So SSL stands for Session Security Layer. And if you remember from like networking, you probably looked at this OSI model. And so there's a layer called the session layer. And then there's a layer called the transport. The transport's like a lower layer. And so something that would end up in the header of HTTP packets would be covered by the transport layer, but they wouldn't be, the session would be like what's inside the packet itself. Like the HTML would be at the session level and the HTTP would be at the transport level. And so they wanted to people were confused about the encryption only covering like the session layer, but it actually covers from the transport layer up. So anyways, that's why that was part of the motivation for changing the name. But, okay, so the headers are covered by encryption. Okay, now I also worded it kind of weird. I'm like, well, it's the response, right? Well, is the response? Why didn't I say the request? If the request goes over HTTPS, then the response will come back the same way, right? And the answer is that, remember, websites are sometimes weaving content together, okay? So you might go to an HTTP website, but then they say, oh, go grab this image, but grab it over HTTPS. Or it might be the opposite. They might be like, You connect to the website over HTTPS, but they start loading resources, and those resources are over HTTP. Okay? So whether you see the lock in your browser doesn't mean that the cookies that were used to construct what you're seeing on the screen were necessarily sent over HTTPS. You'd have to dig down deeper and see whether the resources, the sub-resources, were sent over it or not. Okay? And so, anyways, when you set a cookie, you can also have some control over people that embed things, links to your website, whether you ever send it over HTTP, like even if they want you to. I'll explain it later when we see it. But there's basically a flag in the cookie. So one of them covers whether you only send it over HTTP, and one covers whether you ever send it over plain text or not. But just forget about that for now. It will come up later. Okay, so let me just illustrate. So that's the basic mechanics of a cookie, and then let's just see how it kind of works. This is stuff that we covered in Words, but just to get it on the page. Like a username, password kind of login scenario. So let's say we're going to Google. So I send my username and password to Google. Then Google will create a database themselves. And so it will say, okay, I saw this user, PulpSpy, and they logged in, and this is the cookie I gave them. And then they'll have some, usually, conditions for when they'll honor it as well. So they may implement an expiry. They may decide that it needs to be the same IP address as well. Otherwise, we're going to ask them to log in, or same country. Like maybe there's some flexibility. We don't know. And they probably use machine learning and stuff like that to like come up with these rules, and they're really complicated. Maybe no human even understands them. It's some like intrusion detection system or something. But they'll have a bunch of conditions. And so Google themselves may choose to cross this off and say, okay, this is no longer a valid login, but your browser will keep sending it. So your browser has this cookie for Google. And on all future requests until that cookie either expires browser side, okay, or the website overwrites it with another value, you'll keep sending 55 every time you go to Google. But then Google can choose whether to do anything with that or not. Okay, so they might choose to ignore it or not. Okay. Now, one thing you can do is when you set your cookie is you can have an expiry condition here. So it can be date-based, or you can say when browser closes. Those are the two main options. Okay, so when you close your browser will actually go in and delete it from the cookie jar. Then this request is never sent back to Google. Okay? If it expires server side, then the request keeps getting sent, but Google's just ignoring it. Okay? So there's slight differences in that case, but functionally it ends up being the same. Okay, is there questions about this? Okay, let's see. We're actually at a kind of natural breaking point, and so I know there's 15 minutes left, but I'm sure everyone's happy to leave 15 minutes early. So why don't we'll just break here, and then we have 2 more lectures anyways to cover all the rest of this material. All right, so have a good week, everyone, and I'll see you.